It was a Tuesday afternoon when my world collapsed. Not with a bang, not with a screaming match, not even with tears. It happened quietly, in a sterile law office that smelled like old paper and regret. My parents sat across from me, their faces carefully arranged into something that looked like grief but felt like victory. And when the lawyer opened the will and read the words aloud, I understood for the first time in my life what it meant to be erased. My grandfather, Arthur Whitmore, had passed away 3 weeks earlier. He was 87 years old, a retired surgeon who had built a fortune from nothing. His hands had saved lives. His mind had built wealth. And in his final years, I was the only one who stayed. I remember sitting with him in his study, the afternoon light filtering through the dust on his bookshelves. His hands trembled now, but his eyes were still sharp. He looked at me and said something I've never forgotten. Asterisk, they think I don't see it, Emma. They think because I'm old, I've gone blind. But I see everything. Asterisk, he was talking about my parents. My mother, Patricia, had married into the Whitmore family when she was 23, and from day one, she treated my grandfather like an obstacle. My father, Richard, was his only son, a man who had inherited his father's last name but none of his work ethic. Together, they had spent 30 years waiting for the old man to die, waiting for the inheritance they felt they deserved. And me, I was the inconvenient witness. Growing up, I never quite fit into my parents' world. They wanted a daughter who would play the part, who would marry well, smile politely, and never ask questions. Instead, they got me. I spent weekends at my grandfather's house, learning chess in his library, listening to his stories about the patients he saved, the deals he made, the mistakes he never repeated. He was the only one who ever looked at me like I mattered. By the time I turned 32, I had built a quiet life for myself. I worked as a librarian in a small town 2 hours away from my parents. It wasn't glamorous, and it certainly wasn't what they had planned for me. My mother made that clear every Thanksgiving when she'd introduce me to her friends as our daughter, the librarian, as if the word left a bad taste in her mouth. My father barely acknowledged me unless he needed something. But my grandfather never let me feel like a disappointment. When I told him I loved my job, he smiled and said, Asterisk, good. You found something they never will. Asterisk, I didn't ask what he meant. I think I already knew. When his health began to fail, it was me who drove the 2 hours each week to check on him. Me who sat with him during his chemotherapy appointments. Me who held his hand when the pain was bad. My parents visited twice. Twice. Both times, they spent more time looking around his house, calculating the value of his furniture, than they did sitting at his bedside. I saw it, and I said nothing, because I thought, if I just kept the peace, maybe things would be different when he was gone. Maybe they would finally see me. I was wrong. The call came on a Sunday morning. The hospice nurse had a soft voice, the kind you use when you're about to deliver news that changes everything. Asterisk, he passed peacefully, Emma. He wasn't alone. Asterisk, I was alone when I heard it, sitting in my small apartment, still wearing my pajamas, a half-empty coffee mug beside me. I didn't cry. I sat there for a long time, staring at the wall, waiting for the grief to hit. But all I felt was a strange, hollow calm, because a part of me had been saying goodbye to him for years. 3 days later, my mother called. Asterisk, the reading is Tuesday. Don't be late. Asterisk, no, how are you? No, I'm sorry about your grandfather. Just instructions. Because to my mother, everything was an instruction, and I had spent my whole life following them. I arrived at the law office 20 minutes early. The building was old, with marble floors and brass fixtures that had tarnished with age. It felt like a place where secrets were kept, the kind of place my grandfather would have chosen. I sat in the waiting room, running my fingers over the spine of a magazine I wasn't reading, and tried to prepare myself for what was coming. My parents walked in at exactly 1:58 p.m. My mother wore a black dress that probably cost more than my rent. My father had on a suit I'd never seen before, his hair freshly cut, his shoes polished. They looked like they were going to a funeral, but their eyes gave them away. There was anticipation there. Excitement, almost. My mother saw me sitting in the corner and offered a tight smile. Asterisk, Emma, you look tired. Asterisk, I didn't respond. What was there to say? We both knew she didn't care how I looked. She was checking my temperature, measuring my mood, trying to see if I knew something she didn't. I didn't. Not yet. The lawyer, a man named Mr. Holloway who had been my grandfather's attorney for over 40 years, opened the door to his office and gestured us inside. The room was wood-paneled, heavy with the weight of decades. A single window looked out onto a gray sky. On his desk sat a single envelope, just one. My father's eyes fixed on it immediately. I saw his jaw tighten, his posture shift. He was doing the math in his head. We all were. Mr. Holloway began with the formalities. The date of death, the validation of the will, the legal language that blurred into background noise. I watched my parents sit side by side, their bodies angled toward the desk, ready to receive whatever my grandfather had left them. And then Mr. Holloway opened the envelope and began to read. I, Arthur James Whitmore, being of sound mind and memory, do hereby declare this to be my last will and testament. He read for several minutes, listing small bequests to charities, to the hospital where he had worked, to a cousin I'd never met, a painting to the local library, a collection of books to his alma mater. Each word seemed to tighten the air in the room. Then he paused, cleared his throat, and read the words that changed everything. Asterisk, to my son, Richard Whitmore, and his wife, Patricia Whitmore, I leave the sum of $1, to be divided equally between them. This is not a mistake. They will understand why. Asterisk, the silence that followed was so complete I could hear the clock ticking on Mr. Holloway's wall. My mother's face went pale, then red. My father looked like he'd been slapped. Asterisk, $1. Asterisk, my mother whispered. Her voice cracked on the word. My father stood up. His chair scraped against the floor with a sound like tearing metal. Asterisk, this is absurd. There must be another document. A codicil. Something. Asterisk, Mr. Holloway didn't flinch. He had known my grandfather for 40 years. He had probably seen this coming. Asterisk, Mr. Whitmore, your father was very clear about his intentions. He reviewed this document with me 3 times in the last year of his life. Each time, he confirmed the same distribution. Asterisk, that's not possible, my mother said, her voice rising. Asterisk, we are his family. His only family. Asterisk, she said it without looking at me. I was standing right there. And she said only family like I didn't exist. My father was pacing now, his composure crumbling. Asterisk, he was old. He wasn't in his right mind. You know that. The cancer, the medication, he wasn't himself. Asterisk, Mr. Holloway removed his glasses and set them down carefully on the desk. Asterisk, Mr. Whitmore, your father was assessed by 2 independent physicians during the drafting of this will. Both certified that he was of sound mind. I can provide those documents if you wish to contest them. Asterisk, my mother grabbed my father's arm. Her nails dug into his sleeve. I saw her eyes flick to me. Quick, sharp, calculating. This is your doing, she said. Not a question. An accusation. I opened my mouth to respond, but nothing came out. What could I say? I didn't know. I hadn't known. My grandfather had never told me what was in the will. He had only smiled that quiet smile of his and said, Asterisk, they'll understand when the time comes. Asterisk, but they didn't understand. They were furious, and they were looking at me like I had stolen something from them. My father turned to Mr. Holloway. Asterisk, there's more. There has to be more. My father had accounts, property, investments. Where's all of it? Asterisk, Mr. Holloway's expression didn't change. He folded his hands on the desk and spoke in the same measured tone he'd used through the entire reading. Asterisk, I am authorized to tell you that the bulk of your father's estate, the house, the investment accounts, the remaining liquid assets, are not addressed in this will. Asterisk, my mother's grip on my father's arm tightened. Asterisk, then where are they? Asterisk, Mr. Holloway looked at me. Just for a moment. Then his gaze returned to my parents. Asterisk, I am not at liberty to say. Not yet. Asterisk, the room went very still. My father slammed his hand on the desk. The sound made me jump. Asterisk, this is outrageous. You can't withhold information from us. We are the direct heirs. The will is invalid if it doesn't account for the entire estate. Asterisk, Mr. Holloway stood up slowly. He was a small man, thin and unassuming, but when he stood, there was a gravity to him that made my father step back. Asterisk, Mr. Whitmore, I have been practicing law for 43 years. I have never once been found to be in violation of my ethical obligations. Your father's instructions were explicit, and I intend to follow them to the letter. If you wish to contest the will, you are free to do so. I would advise you, however, to consider what your father might have anticipated. Asterisk, my father opened his mouth to argue, but my mother pulled him back. She had composed herself now. Her face was smooth, controlled, but her eyes were cold. Asterisk, we'll be in touch, Mr. Holloway. Asterisk, she turned to leave, and my father followed, stumbling over himself to keep up with her. At the door, my mother paused. She looked back at me, still standing in the corner of the office, still trying to process what had just happened. Don't think this is over, she said. Her voice was quiet, but it cut like a blade. Asterisk, we will find out what he hid, and when we do, you will regret whatever part you played in this. Asterisk, then they were gone. The door closed behind them with a soft click, and I was alone with Mr. Holloway and the echo of my mother's words. I stood there for a long moment, my legs unsteady, my heart pounding in my chest. I hadn't asked for any of this. I hadn't even known. Mr. Holloway walked around his desk and sat down heavily in his chair. He looked tired, older than he had when we walked in. Asterisk, Miss Whitmore, he said. Please, sit down. Asterisk, I sat. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a second envelope. It was identical to the first, cream-colored paper, my grandfather's name written across the front in careful script. But this one was sealed. Asterisk, your grandfather asked me to give you this. Alone, without your parents present. Asterisk, he slid the envelope across the desk. I could see my name written on it, in my grandfather's handwriting. The same hand that had taught me to play chess. The same hand that had held mine during his chemotherapy. My fingers trembled as I picked it up. He told me to tell you, Mr. Holloway said, his voice softer now. Asterisk, that he was sorry. Not for what he left you, but for what he knew you would have to endure before this was over. Asterisk, I looked at the envelope in my hands. It was heavier than I expected. Not just paper, something else. A key. A photograph. I couldn't tell. Asterisk, what's inside? Asterisk, I asked. Mr. Holloway shook his head. Asterisk, I don't know. He never told me. He said you would know what to do when you read it. Asterisk, I turned the envelope over in my hands. On the back, in the same careful script, my grandfather had written 4 words. Asterisk, trust no one. Not even them. Asterisk, my parents had walked out thinking they had been cheated. They had no idea that the real secret was still sitting on the lawyer's desk. And I had no idea that the envelope in my hands was about to destroy everything they thought they knew. I didn't open the envelope in Mr. Holloway's office. I couldn't. My hands were shaking too much, and I could feel his eyes on me, waiting to see what I would do. Instead, I slipped it into my bag, thanked him, and walked out into the gray afternoon air. The drive home took 2 hours. I spent the first hour in silence, my mind replaying the scene in the lawyer's office. My mother's accusation, my father's rage, the way they had looked at me like I was the enemy, and beneath it all, the weight of the envelope in my bag, pressing against my hip like a secret I wasn't ready to carry. By the time I pulled into my apartment complex, it was dark. I sat in the car for a long time, engine off, listening to the rain start to fall. The envelope sat on the passenger seat. My grandfather's handwriting stared up at me, Emma. I picked it up, ran my thumb over the seal, and then, instead of opening it, I put it back in my bag and went inside. I wasn't ready. Not yet. That night I didn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my grandfather's words echoing in my head. They think I don't see it, Emma. But I see everything. What did he see that I didn't? What had he been planning? The next morning, I called in sick to work. I made coffee, sat at my kitchen table, and finally took out the envelope. My hands were steady now. Or maybe I had just stopped pretending they would ever be steady again. I slid a knife under the seal and pulled out the contents. There were 3 things inside. A letter, 3 pages long, written in my grandfather's careful script. A key, old and brass, tarnished at the edges. And a photograph. The photograph was the first thing I looked at. It showed a woman I had never seen before, standing in front of a house I didn't recognize. She was young, maybe in her 20s, with dark hair and a smile that looked familiar. I stared at her face for a long time, trying to place her. There was something in her eyes, something that made my chest tighten. I set the photograph aside and picked up the letter. My dearest Emma, if you are reading this, then I am gone. And I am sorry. Not for leaving you. We both knew that day would come, but for what I am about to ask of you. You have always been the one who saw clearly. You knew, even as a child, that your parents were not the people they pretended to be. You never said it aloud, but I saw it in the way you watched them. The way you flinched when your mother's voice turned sharp. The way you disappeared into my library when your father's silences grew too heavy. You were not born into a family, Emma. You were born into a performance. And for 30 years, you have played your part without complaint. I am going to tell you something now that I should have told you years ago. Something I was too afraid to say when I was alive. But the dead have no excuses. Your father is not my son. I stopped reading. The words blurred in front of me. I set the letter down, pressed my palms against the table, and forced myself to breathe. Your father is not my son. The sentence didn't make sense. Richard Whitmore was my grandfather's only child. Everyone knew that. It was a fact as solid as the house he grew up in, the name he carried, the inheritance he had spent his whole life waiting for. I picked up the letter again and kept reading. I discovered the truth in 1972, 3 years after your father was born. Your grandmother, my wife Eleanor, had been ill after his birth. Complications that left her bedridden for months. In her delirium, she confessed to a nurse that Richard was not mine. The nurse, a kind woman who had grown fond of Eleanor, did not report it. But she came to me, privately, and told me what she had heard. I did not believe her at first. I could not. Richard looked like me, or so I told myself. He had my coloring, my build. But over the years, the truth became impossible to ignore. He had none of my interests, none of my temperament. He was a stranger in my house, wearing my name. I confronted Eleanor before she died. She confirmed it. Richard's biological father was a man she had known before me, a man she had never stopped loving. She begged me to keep the secret. She said it would destroy Richard to know. And I, coward that I was, agreed. I kept the secret for 50 years. I raised another man's son as my own. I watched him grow into a man who resented me, who saw me only as a source of money, who never once asked who I was or what I had sacrificed for him. And I said nothing. But I could not let you inherit that lie. You are not Richard's daughter. Not biologically. Your mother, Patricia, was already pregnant with you when she married him. She does not know that I know this. She thinks the secret died with the man who fathered you, a man whose name I have never been able to discover. But I know that you carry none of Richard's blood, and I know that Richard has always suspected it. That is why he has kept you at a distance. That is why your mother has always treated you like an obligation rather than a child. You are not obligated to them, Emma. You never were. The key in this envelope belongs to a safety deposit box at the bank on Main Street in my hometown. The box contains everything I could not put in the will, deeds, accounts, documents, everything that would have made your parents rich, everything that I chose instead to leave to you. But there is something else in that box, something I found when I finally had the courage to search for the truth. A document that proves Richard is not my son. A document that, if made public, would strip him of the name he has carried his whole life. I have never used it. I could not bring myself to destroy a man I had raised, even a man I did not love, but I leave that choice to you. You are the only real Whitmore, Emma. Not by blood, but by choice, by character, by the life you have built on your own, without their help, without their approval. I love you. I have always loved you. And I am sorry I could not say this to your face. Your grandfather, Arthur Whitmore. The letter slipped from my fingers. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the photograph of the woman I didn't recognize, and felt the ground shift beneath me. My father wasn't my grandfather's son, and I wasn't my father's daughter. The two people who had spent my whole life making me feel like an outsider, they were the outsiders. The name I had carried, the family I had tried so hard to belong to, none of it was real. I don't know how long I sat there. Hours, maybe. The rain stopped. The sun came out. My coffee grew cold, and when I finally moved, it was to pick up the key and hold it in my palm. The bank. The safety deposit box. The document that could destroy everything. I knew my parents. I knew what they would do when they found out about the will. They would contest it. They would hire lawyers. They would dig through my grandfather's life, looking for anything they could use to prove he wasn't in his right mind. And in the process, they might find the truth before I did. I couldn't let that happen. The next morning, I drove to my grandfather's hometown. It was a small place, the kind of town where everyone knew everyone. The bank was on Main Street, just like he said, an old building with a brass sign and a single teller who looked up when I walked in. I presented the key, signed the forms, and waited while a young woman disappeared into the vault. When she returned, she was carrying a metal box, heavy and unremarkable. She set it on a table in a private room and left me alone. I opened the box slowly. Inside, I found what my grandfather had promised. Bank statements, property deeds, investment portfolios, enough wealth to make my parents' heads spin. But I barely looked at those. My eyes went straight to the manila envelope at the bottom, thick and yellowed with age. I pulled it out. My hands were steady now. Whatever was inside, I was ready. The envelope contained a single document. A birth certificate. Not for my father. For a man named Daniel Cross, born in 1942. The date matched my father's birth year. The parents listed were not Arthur and Eleanor Whitmore. They were names I didn't recognize. And beneath the birth certificate, a letter from a hospital in 1972, confirming that Eleanor Whitmore had given birth to a son who died shortly after delivery. A son who would have been Arthur Whitmore's only child. My father was not that child. He was a replacement, a secret, a lie that had been buried for 50 years. I sat in that small room, the document in my hands, and for the first time in my life, I understood why my parents had treated me the way they did. They had spent their whole lives pretending to be Whitmores, pretending to be a family, and they had made me the scapegoat, the outsider, the one who didn't belong, because the truth was, they were the ones who didn't belong. I had a choice now. I could take this document to a lawyer. I could expose the truth. I could watch my parents lose everything, the name, the status, the inheritance they thought was theirs. Or I could keep it hidden. Let them contest the will. Let them waste their money on lawyers and lies. Let them destroy themselves without ever knowing that the truth had been sitting in a safety deposit box all along. I closed the box. I put the key in my pocket, and I walked out into the sunlight with a weight on my shoulders that felt like the beginning of something I couldn't yet name. Because my grandfather had given me more than money. He had given me the truth. And the truth, I was beginning to realize, was the most dangerous weapon I would ever hold. My parents thought they had been cheated. They thought the fight was about a will and a fortune they deserved. They had no idea that the real battle was about something far more fragile, the identity they had built on a foundation of lies. And I had the power to bring it all down. If you've ever been excluded by your family, drop a broken heart in the comments. You're not alone. I drove home from the bank with the truth, burning a hole in my bag. The safety deposit box was empty now. I had taken everything. The deeds, the accounts, the documents, the letter. All of it sat in a folder on my passenger seat, waiting for me to decide what to do next. For 3 days, I did nothing. I went to work. I shelved books. I smiled at patrons who asked if I was feeling all right. And every night, I sat in my apartment and stared at the folder, trying to imagine what my grandfather would want me to do. He had given me a choice. I leave that choice to you, he wrote. But what was the right choice? To expose the truth and watch my parents crumble? Or to let them live in their ignorance, chasing an inheritance they would never receive, slowly destroying themselves with their own greed? I didn't have to decide right away, but my parents made sure I didn't have the luxury of time. On the 4th day, my phone rang. It was my mother. "We need to talk," she said. Her voice was clipped, controlled. The voice she used when she was angry but didn't want to show it. Your father and I have hired an attorney. We're contesting the will. I said nothing. Did you hear me, Emma? I heard you. We'll be meeting with Mr. Holloway next week. We're going to request a full accounting of your grandfather's estate. And we want you there. Why? There was a pause. I could hear her breathing, measured and deliberate. Because you were the last person to see him alone. The lawyer will want to know what he told you. What he gave you. So she suspected. Of course she did. My mother had always been good at reading people, especially me. He didn't give me anything, I said. The lie came out smoother than I expected. I don't believe you. That's your choice. Another pause. Then her voice dropped, lower and colder than I had ever heard it. Let me be very clear, Emma. Your grandfather was not in his right mind. We have doctors who will testify to that. We have witnesses who will say he became paranoid in his final years. The will is going to be thrown out, and when it is, everything will go to your father. That is the law. That is how it works. So whatever he told you, whatever he promised you, it means nothing. I closed my eyes. My fingers gripped the phone. Is that all? Be at the meeting, Emma. Or I promise you will regret it. She hung up before I could respond. I stood in my kitchen, the phone still pressed to my ear, listening to the dial tone. And in that moment, I knew what my grandfather had meant when he wrote. I knew what you would have to endure. They were going to fight. They were going to lie. They were going to drag my grandfather's name through the mud, claim he was senile, claim he didn't know what he was doing. And they were going to use the law to take everything that wasn't theirs. Unless I stopped them. I opened the folder and pulled out the birth certificate. The document that proved Richard Whitmore was not Arthur Whitmore's son. The truth that would shatter their world. My hand shook as I held it. I had never been a confrontational person. I had spent my whole life avoiding conflict, keeping the peace, making myself small so my parents' anger would pass me by. But this wasn't about peace anymore. This was about my grandfather's final wish. And I wasn't going to let them destroy it. I picked up my phone again and called Mr. Holloway. The meeting was set for Friday morning. I arrived an hour early, carrying the folder under my arm like armor. Mr. Holloway's office looked the same as it had the first time, wood-paneled, heavy with history, the single window looking out onto a gray sky. But this time, I wasn't sitting in the corner, invisible. This time, I was the one with the answers. Mr. Holloway greeted me with a quiet nod. You found what you were looking for? I did. He didn't ask what it was. He simply gestured to a chair and said, Your parents will be here soon. Are you ready? I thought about it. Was I ready to watch my parents' faces when I told them the truth? Was I ready for the fallout, the rage, the accusations that would surely follow? No, I said honestly, but I'm going to do it anyway. My parents arrived at exactly 9 a.m. They came with a lawyer, a sharp-faced woman in an expensive suit who introduced herself as Miss Vance. My mother looked composed, her hair perfect, her dress immaculate. My father stood behind her, his jaw tight, his eyes scanning the room like he was looking for something to steal. They sat across from me. My mother's gaze fell on the folder in my hands, and I saw something flicker in her eyes. Fear, maybe, or recognition. Let's get this over with, she said. Mr. Holloway began by reviewing the will again, reading the same passages he had read a week earlier. My parents' lawyer interrupted twice, asking about medical records, about my grandfather's mental state, about the possibility of undue influence. And then, exactly as I had predicted, my mother leaned forward and pointed at me. She was with him constantly in his final months. She had access to him when no one else did. She manipulated him. She turned him against us. Her voice was steady, confident. She had rehearsed this. She had probably been planning it for years. That's a serious accusation, Mrs. Whitmore, Mr. Holloway said. Do you have any evidence to support it? I have the will, she snapped. What other evidence do you need? A father doesn't leave his only son $1 unless someone has poisoned his mind. I sat very still. My hands were folded on top of the folder, hiding the truth inside. I could feel my heart pounding, but my voice, when it came out, was calm. He wasn't his son. The words fell into the silence like stones into still water. My mother's head snapped toward me. "What did you say?" I opened the folder. I pulled out the birth certificate. I pulled out the hospital letter. And I set them on the table, face up, for everyone to see. Richard Whitmore was born in 1942 to parents who are not Arthur and Eleanor Whitmore. His birth certificate lists a different name, different parents. Eleanor Whitmore gave birth to a son who died shortly after delivery. Richard was brought in to replace him. The hospital records are in that folder. So is the letter from the nurse who heard Eleanor's confession. My father stared at the documents. His face had gone pale, then red, then pale again. His hands were gripping the arms of his chair so hard I thought the wood might splinter. "That's impossible," he whispered. My mother's lawyer picked up the birth certificate, scanned it, and set it back down. Her face was unreadable. My mother, for once, had nothing to say. She was looking at the documents, at her husband, at me. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish pulled from water. "Your grandfather discovered the truth in 1972. I continued. "He knew for 50 years that Richard was not his son. He kept the secret to protect your family, to protect your mother, to protect all of you. But he couldn't let the lie continue. That's why he left you $1. Not out of spite, out of honesty." My father stood up so fast his chair tipped backward and crashed against the wall. His face was twisted, unrecognizable. "You're lying," he shouted. "You forged these documents. You're trying to steal what's mine." "They're not mine," I said quietly. "They're his. He gave them to me. He wanted me to have the truth." "The truth?" My father's voice cracked. He looked at my mother, then back at me, then at the documents on the table. His hands were shaking. "You think I don't know the truth? You think I didn't know he never loved me?" The room went very quiet. My mother's lawyer cleared her throat. "Perhaps we should take a recess." "No," my father said. His voice was raw, broken. "No. Let her finish. Let her tell everyone what she thinks she knows." He sat back down heavily, his eyes fixed on me. And for the first time in my life, I saw something in them that wasn't indifference or resentment. It was fear. I looked at my mother. She hadn't moved. Her face was a mask, but her hands were trembling in her lap. She knew. She had always known. "You knew, didn't you?" I said to her. "You knew Richard wasn't a Whitmore. That's why you pushed so hard for the inheritance. That's why you couldn't stand my grandfather. Because you knew the truth could come out at any moment." She didn't answer. She didn't have to. The silence was answer enough. I turned back to my father. "He raised you as his own. He gave you his name. He gave you everything he could. And you spent your whole life resenting him because you thought he didn't love you enough. But he loved you more than you deserved. He loved you enough to keep a secret that would have destroyed you." My father's eyes were wet. I had never seen him cry. Not once in 32 years. "He was never my father," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "He was just a man who paid for things." I pulled out the last document from the folder. It was a letter my grandfather had written to me, the one I had already read a dozen times. But there was a passage I hadn't shared yet at the very end. "He wrote this," I said, and I read aloud. "I raised another man's son as my own. I watched him grow into a man who resented me. And I said nothing, not because I was a coward, but because he was my son, even if he wasn't my blood. And I loved him enough to let him hate me." My father's face crumpled. He made a sound I had never heard from him, a sound like something breaking. And then he buried his face in his hands and wept. My mother reached for him, but he pulled away. "Don't," he said. "Don't touch me." I folded the letter and put it back in the folder. I had done what I came to do. The truth was out. The secret that had poisoned 3 generations was finally in the light. But I knew this wasn't over. There would be lawyers, fights, accusations. My parents would try to spin this, to twist it, to find some way to salvage what they had lost. And my father's tears, would they turn to rage? Would he forgive me for what I had done? Or would he spend the rest of his life hating me the way he had hated my grandfather? I gathered my things. Mr. Holloway watched me with something like respect. My mother's lawyer was already on her phone, probably calling for damage control. As I walked toward the door, my mother spoke. "You think you've won," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the noise. "You think this makes you one of them?" I stopped, turned. "I don't want to be one of them," I said. "I never did." And I walked out, leaving the truth behind me like a grenade whose pin I had just pulled. I didn't go home right away. Instead, I drove to the cemetery where my grandfather was buried. The afternoon light was golden, filtering through the old oak trees that lined the path. I found his grave easily, a simple headstone, just his name and the dates. No grand monument, no elaborate epitaph. That wasn't who he was. I sat on the grass beside him and pulled out the letter I had read 100 times. I didn't need to read it again. I already knew every word by heart. But I wanted to be near him when I finally let myself feel what I had done. I told them. I said aloud, my voice small in the quiet of the cemetery. I told them everything. The wind rustled through the trees. A bird called somewhere in the distance. And for the first time in weeks, I felt something loosen in my chest. I had spent my whole life trying to earn a place in a family that was never mine. I had bent myself into shapes that didn't fit, silenced myself when I wanted to speak, made myself small when I wanted to stand tall. And all along, my grandfather had seen it. He had watched me fight for approval from people who had built their entire lives on a lie. Now the truth was out, and no matter what happened next, I was free. The weeks that followed were chaos, exactly as I had expected. My parents hired a new lawyer. The sharp-faced woman had dropped them the day after the meeting, citing a conflict of interest. The replacement was aggressive, filing motions to contest the will, demanding psychological evaluations, trying to argue that my grandfather had been manipulated in his final years. But the evidence was against them. The 2 independent physicians who had certified his mental capacity, the 40 years of records with Mr. Holloway, the safety deposit box with documents that predated his illness by decades. And then there was the birth certificate. My father tried to deny it at first. He claimed the documents were forged, that I had fabricated them to steal his inheritance. But Mr. Holloway had already sent them for authentication. When the results came back, certified, original, irrefutable, my father's case crumbled. I wasn't there when he found out, but I heard about it from Mr. Holloway. He sat in my office for 3 hours, the old lawyer told me over the phone. He didn't speak. He just stared at the documents. His wife tried to leave twice. He wouldn't let her. What happened? I asked. Eventually, he asked me if there was anything in your grandfather's letter for him. Anything at all. I closed my eyes. What did you tell him? I told him the truth. That your grandfather loved him. That he chose to raise him knowing he wasn't his blood. That the $1 wasn't an insult, it was a confirmation. He was leaving Richard everything he had always given him. A name, a life, a chance to be something other than what he was born into. I didn't ask what my father said in response. I didn't need to know. Whatever he felt, whatever he decided to do with that truth, that was his burden now, not mine. The court ruled in my favor 6 weeks later. The will was upheld. The estate passed to me, exactly as my grandfather had intended. And when the judgment was read, my parents weren't there to hear it. They had stopped showing up weeks before, when it became clear that no amount of legal maneuvering could undo the truth. I inherited the house I had grown up visiting, the library where my grandfather taught me chess, the study where he sat with his books and his memories, the bedroom where he spent his final days, with me beside him, holding his hand. I inherited the money, too, more money than I had ever imagined. Enough to quit my job if I wanted to. Enough to travel. Enough to do nothing for the rest of my life, if that was what I chose. But that wasn't what I chose. A year passed. I kept my job at the library, not because I needed it, but because I loved it. I bought a small house of my own, close to the town where I had grown up, close to my grandfather's grave. I visited him every Sunday, bringing flowers or just sitting in the grass, telling him about my week. My parents, for the most part, left me alone. My mother called once, 6 months after the court ruling. Her voice was different, softer, less certain. "Your father wants to see you," she said. I didn't answer right away. I thought about the last time I had seen him, his face crumpled in Mr. Holloway's office, his hands shaking, his eyes wet. "Why?" I asked. "He's been going to therapy," she said. The words came out like she was confessing something shameful. "He's been working through things. He wants to apologize." I sat in my kitchen, the phone pressed to my ear, and thought about what my grandfather would want. He had forgiven my father for a lifetime of resentment. He had loved a man who wasn't his son because love, he had written, was not about blood. "Tell him I'll meet him," I said. "At the cemetery. On Sunday." Sunday came, clear and bright. I arrived at the cemetery an hour early, as I always did. I sat by my grandfather's grave and waited. When my father arrived, I almost didn't recognize him. He had lost weight. His hair was gray now, thinner than I remembered. He walked slowly, his hands in the pockets of a jacket that looked too big for him. My mother stood by the car, watching from a distance. She didn't come closer. My father stopped a few feet away from me. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The wind moved through the trees. A bird sang somewhere in the branches. "I've been coming here," he said finally. His voice was rough and used to speaking. "Every week. I sit here and I try to think of something to say to him. But I can't." I looked at the headstone. "What would you say if you could?" He was quiet for a long time. When he spoke again, his voice cracked. "I would say I'm sorry. I would say I wasted 30 years being angry at a man who saved my life, who gave me everything, who never once asked for anything in return." He looked at me then, his eyes red-rimmed, his face open in a way I had never seen before. "I would say I'm sorry to you, too, for the way I treated you, for the way I let your mother," he stopped, swallowed, "for the way I made you feel like you didn't belong. When it was me. It was always me. I didn't cry. I had done my crying already, in the months after the reading, in the quiet of my grandfather's house, in the library where I had learned to love books more than people. I was done crying. He forgave you," I said, "before he died. He told me. He said you were his son, even if you weren't his blood, and he loved you enough to let you hate him." My father's face crumpled the way it had in Mr. Holloway's office. He sank to his knees on the grass, his hands pressed against the headstone, his shoulders shaking. I didn't move to comfort him. That wasn't my role anymore. But I didn't leave either. We sat there, father and daughter, two people who had spent their whole lives pretending to be something they weren't. And for the first time, the silence between us wasn't a weapon. It was just silence. My mother never came to the cemetery. She sent a letter, months later, typed on expensive stationery, filled with sentences that sounded like they had been written by someone else. She apologized for the wedding, for the birthday she forgot, for the way she looked at me when she thought I wasn't watching. I read the letter once. Then I put it in a drawer and didn't read it again. Some wounds are too deep for words to heal. Maybe in time, I will find it in myself to forgive her. Maybe I already have in my own way. But forgiveness doesn't mean letting someone back into your life. Sometimes it means letting them go. It's been 3 years now since my grandfather died. 3 years since I opened that envelope and learned the truth about my family. I still work at the library. I still visit his grave on Sundays. I still keep his letter in my nightstand, next to the photograph of the woman I never knew, the woman who might have been my grandmother, or might have been someone else entirely. I never did find out who she was, and somewhere along the way, I stopped needing to know. The house he left me sits empty now. I go there sometimes, to dust the books, to sit in his study, to remember the afternoons we spent together. I think about selling it, sometimes, but I'm not ready. Maybe someday I will be. As for my parents, we have a kind of peace now. Not love, not the kind of love I wanted as a child, but a quiet understanding. They know the truth. They know I know. And in the space between those two truths, we have found a way to exist without destroying each other. I don't know if that's forgiveness. I don't know if it's justice. But it's enough. Here's what I learned from all of this. First, blood doesn't make a family. Choice does. My grandfather chose to love a man who wasn't his son. I chose to love a man who wasn't my father. And in the end, that love was the only thing that was real. Second, the truth will set you free, but only if you let it. I spent 32 years carrying a weight I didn't even know was there. When I finally put it down, I realized I had been strong enough to carry it all along. I just never gave myself permission to let go. Third, you don't have to forgive to move on. You don't have to forget to heal. Sometimes moving forward means accepting that some things will never be what you wanted them to be. And that's okay. And finally, the most important thing my grandfather taught me, you are not what they told you you were. You are not the sum of their failures, their resentments, their secrets. You are the only one who gets to decide who you become. If you've ever been excluded by your family, if you've ever felt like you didn't belong, I want you to know, you're not alone. The family we choose can be just as real, sometimes more real than the family we're born into. Subscribe to Secret Family Files for more stories where the truth finally comes to light. What would you have done in my situation? Would you have revealed the secret or kept it hidden? Let me know.